Hello, and this is a follow-up to the previous video where we planned the implementation of and the design of an address book app. So we've done iteration number 1, this is complete, and now we're working on iteration number 2, and our goal is to display a list of contacts. As we did with the previous video, we apply the app development process. So we'll say step number 1, problem formulation. So that's iteration number 2. But we follow exactly the same steps. Maybe you can say, since this is iteration 2, you can say 2.1 here so that you can mark the iteration, or 1, it depends on what you're doing. If you're doing this for yourself, it doesn't matter. But if you have a team, and numbering and referring to different steps will be important, maybe you want to add the iteration number to your numbering system. So we want to display a list, so we'll define the scope. And our scope here is that user opens the app and a list of contacts is displayed. That's all what we're doing in this step. They're not going to be able to add a new contact. We're not going to be able to review details or anything like that. Just see the list of contacts. So how are we going to test it? So the testing scenario is straightforward, and actually the scope and the testing scenario may be the same. So, but we want to know what kind of contacts we want to include in here. So we can say that maybe we open a sample contact, and so maybe we'll say test or John Doe or something. As a sample contact, we'll have just one sample contact for this test. Then step number 2 is the solution formulation. And in the solution formulation, we follow the model view controller. So we start with the model. And we have some ideas in the model from the previous iteration that we said we're going to use the NS mutable array library to represent the list of contacts. And this list of contacts will be managed by the table view controller, and we will see in the view and the controller how we're going to connect them to each other. But there is also something in the model which is the contact. So how are we going to model a contact? The custom type is defined as a class, and a class is a unit of software. I like to call it a module. A module of software that represents a type. In other words, a class is the unit of software that is the blueprint of the software units that participates in the application. These software units, we call them objects. So an object is an actual unit in memory. Actual software unit in memory. And the class is the blueprint of that object. The best example I like to give for this is that the car that you drive is an object. Where is the blueprint of that car? The blueprint of that car is in the factory. And somebody designs the car, designs everything about it, then hand it to the factory. And the factory basically creates instances of that blueprint. So the class is where you design the piece of software, and when you run your app, the app manufactures instances of that class and put it in memory, which is the simulate real life. So for contact, we need to create a class to represent the contact type or the contact model, so that our app, every time it adds a contact, it creates a contact object or an instance of that class. The purpose of the class is to create the blueprint of what a contact is. So the class module starts with the beginning curly brace and end with the curly brace, and two things can come inside a class. The class can have what we call attributes. Maybe give it a different color. Attributes. And the attributes are data that describe the characteristics of the class. An attribute of a car are all the nouns that describe the car. So you can say this car is two-door, then that's an attribute. You can say that this car is four-cylinder, so that's an attribute. You can say that this car has a 57-inch of length, so that's an attribute, and so on and so forth. The class also contains what we call the attributes and the behavior. So attributes, what describes the class or the object, what describes the object. Behaviors is what the object can do. In other words, the behaviors are the functions. So the behaviors are all the different functions that the class has. The attributes are all the different variables and constants that the class has. So for the contact class, in order to create it to describe all the different contact objects, we can say, okay, what are the attributes of a contact? What describes a contact object? So the contact object is described with a first name, it's described with a last name, it's described with an email address. And this is the simplification that I did and referred to the previous iteration discussion for that. You don't have to limit to these three. In fact, the address book that you have has so many more. But if you go back to the very first address book in the very first iPhone device, or even the personal assistance device at the time, it didn't have that many attributes as the one currently have. So every version you enhance. Nobody starts perfect. You start with something and you add to it. And what kind of functions should we have in the contact? One very important function is the initialization function. How you plan to initialize the class. So usually when you create a class with some attributes, you want to provide an initialization function that receives values for these attributes to make it easy for the user. You can have as many initialization functions as you can, and you probably noticed that when we created the strings, when we created NSArray, when we created the Bezier path, there were multiple ways where we can initialize the object of that class, and that's because we define, or the designers of that class defined more than one way to initialize an object of the class. So the same thing here we will do for the contact class. So this is when I'm talking here about the model, and actually my conversation got me a little bit into the controller as well, because in this particular example there is no view. So that's the model of a contact, and we're gonna create our own class and we define the class. In the view, we have one screen for our view, and this screen will display a list. But in the screen, we're using something for the first time, so it is worth talking a little bit about it. The table view controller. The table view controller, and I want to refer you to a very good guide. If you look at the Apple developer website and search for table view controller guide, and I have a link to it from the Blackboard site. If you go to, I think it is in module 5 as a reading, and it's also in the toolbox section. This is a very important guide to tell you a little bit about the table view controller. But like with all other table views, there is a controller of type table view controller, And if you look behind me here, behind this in Xcode, the one highlighted in blue, that is the table view controller. The table view controller, inside it there is a table view. And the table view is a view similar to the different views that we have used before. It is a view like image view and the other views. And inside the view, there is what we call the table view cell. And inside the table view cell, that's where you put what you want to display in the view. So we can put a label. You can put one label, you can put two labels, you can put a label and an image, you can put a button. Literally everything that you could use on a view, you can use here inside a table view cell. So the table view will have more of these cells. As many cells, in fact, as you have data. So when you create a table view, the table view looks for its controller. So the table view is looking for a data source that will provide the table view with how many sections. It provides the table view with how many rows in a section. And what is the cell for each row. In order for us to provide that information to the table controller, we need to manage the collection. The collection of contact, we can manage it from within the custom table view controller if we want, or we can make our own data source class. Our own data source class will then have, if we create a class data source, that class will then have the collection, the contacts collection, as its attribute. And for its functions, it will have multiple functions. We need an initializer, especially if we initialize. But more importantly, we need to provide the count of the contacts. How many in the contact, because this count is important as to provide how many rows. We also need to return a contact at a particular index or a particular row so that we can use that contact to display the contact inside the cell. So these two are very important. And as we proceed, you will see that we also need something to add a contact so that when we implemented a new contact, we're going to need to do that. We can also need to add delete contact, and this is in the extra credit, and move contact in the extra credit again, and save to file and load from file. So the reason I wanted to have my own custom data class here and not rely, as we did in project number 3, on the custom table view controller that we created, which is this one over here, not rely on this, is that I know from envisioning the iteration plan that there could be a lot more to the data source than just providing these two. You may wonder, so you may not know that from the beginning, and you may opt to use the controller to manage the collection, and that is perfectly fine. You don't have to worry. As I said, this is designed and it will grow with you, and you need to allow it to. So if you use the controller as your source and manage the collection from there, that should be fine. And as the iterations becomes more complex and you then decide, that seems like I need to separate the responsibility of the data source from the responsibility of controlling the table view, you can at that time make that separation. As you have built more experience, you will see that you can make those decisions early on, as I am doing it here in separating the data source in its own class. So once we separate the two, we can go to our custom table view controller, and we will learn from reading the table view controller that there are specific functions. And fortunately, And fortunately, the template has created those functions for us. So when we created our address book table view controller and specified that we want this to be a subclass of table view controller, the template, Xcode template, gave us that method that we had to override that says how many sections in the table, and the other method that has the number of rows in section, and the third one that has the cell for row. And you see it is commenting out several other functions that you may want to use, and we will use, in fact, some of them as well. So that then takes us to the last step, which is the solution implementation. So I'll say here 2, 3, and this is the solution implementation. And in that step, we'll start first by creating the contact class, and we'll add the 3 attributes and 2 functions. Then we're going to create the DataSource class that will have 1 attribute for the mutable array, and it will have a function that gives us the count and a function that gives us the contact at an index. Then we'll override or change or add the DataSource as a variable in the table controller, and then use the DataSource to provide the different informations, like the number of rows, number of section, and the cell for row. I'm going to stop here, and we're going to break this implementation over multiple smaller videos so that each chunk is small. So I'll stop here, and in the next video we create the contact class, then another one to create the data source, then a third one to connect all of them together.